The thing about our next speaker, Joan Taylor, that caught my eye was the title of her new book, and it is "What Did Jesus Look Like?" And when I spotted the title, I thought, of course, yes, it's about time somebody is going to address this thing, because, of course, we've seen him depicted every which way, including looking a lot like Fabio. And of course, it doesn't really make sense. So here is a trusted academic, an academic of great depth, who's finally addressing the question, what did he look like? How tall was he? What was the shade? And so on. And the next thing that caught my eye is when I looked into it, Joan is described as the professor of Christian origins and Second Temple Judaism. Now that's refined. Whoa. I thought it was irresistible, so we reached all the way to the UK, and we brought her here. Joan Taylor, please come and address us. Hello.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thanks. Yes, well, thank you. And I'm sure when you think of Jesus, you've all got something in your mind. Sometimes I say to students, close your eyes for a moment and think of Jesus. And everyone can imagine what Jesus looked like. We've actually got the image of Jesus everywhere. It's a global image. It's a phenomenon in terms of an image. So we don't have to work on thinking what Jesus looks like. We can recognize Jesus. And I just want to point out my version of Jesus from when I was 13. And my mother kept this particular image of Jesus and had it on her wall for a while. And I found it recently and I thought, hey, that's actually quite good for that kind of recognizable Jesus, because you can see in this image some of the things we expect from our image of Jesus. For a start, Jesus is European. My 13-year-old Jesus was European. And he has kind of reddish nut brown hair. It's quite long, parted in the middle, a beard. And he's got this long, baggy robe. You can't sort of see but it's normally down to the ground. I've covered it up in a big blue mantle, very large, and baggy sleeves. And that is our Jesus. This is what we learn in Sunday school. This is what we have even in modern films of Jesus, where he looks a bit shaggier and rougher and wearing beige, but he's generally in these long robes with baggy sleeves. So, as Moses said in my book, I wanted to ask this question, what did Jesus really look like? And I wanted to go through all the different evidence over the centuries and try and work out if there was something that was solid in terms of a real memory of Jesus. Did anyone transmit over the centuries something factual? And I went down lots and lots of nooks and crannies to try and find the image of Jesus that is most authentic. What I did find a lot was all these changing images of Jesus, especially in the early period. And I could trace then my Jesus, my 13-year-old Jesus, to something that happened in the 4th and 5th century. So in the 4th and 5th century, they were trying to find an image of Jesus that would really say something, that would give people some theological clues to what he really meant. And we get this image of Jesus with the long hair parted in the middle, the beard, the big robes, actually starting off 4th century, and then the really shown really beautifully in Santa Pudenziana from the beginning of the 5th century. So I don't know, many of you will have gone to Rome and perhaps gone to Santa Pudenziana, it's a lovely little church, and the apse mosaic there has this image of Jesus dressed in a gold toga, looking very much the ruler of the world. He's sitting on a bejeweled throne. He's incredibly in charge. And it seemed to be saying, trust Jesus, he is the guy who rules everything. This is Jesus who is glorified at the end of time. It's very much a cosmic Jesus. You can see the four heavenly beasts in the sky above him. It's all about glory. And the reason Jesus was portrayed in this way, with the hair and the beard, is because they were trying to bring out a memory for the viewers of what they were familiar with in terms of images of Zeus and other gods who had this big hair, long hair and a beard. So Jesus becomes a kind of mini Zeus, a son of Zeus, son of God. And everyone who is familiar with this iconography could go, aha, this is what we get from this particular message in this art. We can see this in the way Zeus is portrayed with this big mantle, this great robe around him. He's partially naked. That was part of the style for many gods. But in fact, in the 2nd, 3rd century, another type of Zeus called Serapis from Egypt was very popular in the Roman Empire. And he had indeed these long robes, exactly the Jesus robes, being worn by Zeus Serapis. And people saw this and recognized that Jesus was better than Zeus Serapis or a young version of this god. So we've got this iconography, the style of art that is all about meaning, all about telling us who Jesus was. He's Alpha and Omega. He's the beginning and the end. This is not the real human being Jesus of Galilee in the 1st century. This is all about proclamation. But what happened was that image of Jesus, that God image of Jesus, then gets transformed into a kind of historical figure. So Jesus is then imagined as looking like that, as walking around Judea and Galilee in the 1st century. It just so happens that no one looked like this in Galilee and Judea in the 1st century. This is not a 1st century Jewish man. So I wanted to find out more. Now, why is this important? Some people have said to me, well, you know, it's all very well, but it's who Jesus was, what he did, what he said that's really important. But yes, I think it is important. If we think about great figures of recent times like Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King, their image, their appearance actually was quite important for what they were saying. And so Martin Luther King dressed in quite nice suits because he was concerned to show the dignity of African Americans. And he wanted to dress in nice suits that would match the fine suits of the white men that he would encounter. And for Gandhi, he dressed in the cotton clothing of the common poor man of India, and actually learnt how to spin cotton. And he was doing that as a kind of statement that he was on the side of these people against the British Empire. So appearance actually does matter in what we do and what we say. And so there's something about Jesus' appearance that could actually, I think, point us to something essential about his message. Now, if because of some weird glitch in information saving, in 1,000 years' time, Gandhi and Martin Luther King were remembered like this, we would start to worry. If that was how they were going to be remembered, losing their ethnicity. And Gandhi being remembered as someone who dressed like Tsar Nicholas II in the royal military style. But that's actually exactly what's happened to Jesus. He's lost his ethnicity and he's dressed in this completely different style of clothing. And not only that, he's dressed in a style of clothing that is associated with the wealthy. So in one of Jesus' sayings, he talks about those men who walk around in long robes as being not like him. He's not a guy who wears long robes, and they have a particular concern with status, because long robes, as Zeus Serapis is dressed in, is the kind of thing that you associate with someone who is in a royal house, who is very well-to-do in society, who is thinking about their own honor and glory. And Jesus was pointing at those people and saying, you're not caring. You're not caring about the poor. You're not showing mercy. You're devouring widows' houses. So that kind of style of clothing, to care a lot about your clothing, was something that indicates the opposite of what Jesus and his disciples were trying to do. So it's really ironic that Jesus is dressed in the long robes that he's criticizing other people for wearing. He's just wearing rough things. The fine clothing belongs to kings and kings' houses. Now, if we want to try and find Jesus as he really was, we have to look at the evidence for Jews in the first century. And one of the interesting things is that given Jesus is not described in the Gospels, I think that it's possible he wasn't described because he was kind of average looking. He wasn't particularly tall, he wasn't particularly short, there was nothing particularly distinguishing about him. He looked like a lot of other guys in terms of his basic body. So this is a coin, these are a couple of coins from the first century which show Jews at this time. In the top, on the top right, you can see a Jewish captive. And you can see that the guy has fairly short hair and a beard. And on the bottom, on the right-hand side, you can see what I think is a Jewish priest. He's got these pants on, which is very unusual. And he's bending the knee to Roman army insignia. He's been forced to bend the knee to Rome. And these were issued at the time of the Jewish revolt in 70, when the Romans put down this revolt. So we've got these images of Jewish men from the first century on Roman coins. So I'm really excited about that because it shows that Jewish men had this kind of shortish hair and a beard. And in fact, that's sort of what we would expect, because the Romans saw Jews as a sort of nation of philosophers, and this was the philosopher look. So that image on the right is from a mummy cask, but I like that image because it indicates the sort of look we're going for here in terms of a first century Jewish face. On the left-hand side, there's a skull, one of the skulls from Qumran, and one of the fascinating things for me was to discover that really interesting work has been done by physical anthropologists on skeletons of Jews excavated in Judea and Galilee from the first century and sometimes second century. And they have really looked at the issue of ethnicity and what people correspond to anciently in terms of modern populations, actually. And they have said that Jews of the first century looked quite a lot like Iraqi Jews today. There's an Iraqi look about the skeletons that they have uncovered. So if we're going to be thinking about Jesus' ethnicity, we should be looking at Iraqi Jews. So I remember when I worked on a kibbutz long ago, some friends of mine who were from Iraq, and it's really fascinating to me to think, yes, they have the look of most of the Jews of first century Judea. So we're thinking brown skin, black hair, brown eyes. Jesus was not a pale person. Jesus was not a European. Think a brown skin, please. And it's important, I think, because it situates him as a Jewish man in his time. If we make him into a European, we're detaching him from his people. He was of his time and place. So that's his head, his shoulders, head and shoulders. He's got probably shortish black hair, beard, not really long hair. That was very unusual in the first century. Sandals on his feet. We found fantastic examples of sandals from the Judean desert caves, really well preserved. So we've got the top and the bottom. What was in between? Well, there's a really interesting saying by Jesus about these people that he objects to, looking for status and glory, and saying they are concerned to be seen by people. They broaden their phylacteries and lengthen their edges. It's one of those strange lines of the Bible that has to be a little bit translated in terms of modern English. Phylacteries we'll get back to, but what are edges? Well, edges in terms of Jewish menswear were tassels that were on the four corners of your mantle. And your mantle was a great big rectangular cloak that you wrapped around you. So, in fact, in the catacombs, in the Roman catacombs, there is a picture of Jesus wearing a mantle with a tassel. And it relates to a story of healing where a woman with an issue of blood grabs hold of this edge, this tassel, and by grabbing hold of it, the power of healing comes out of Jesus, and she's made well. And this was absolutely typical Jewish wear. It was what Jewish men were supposed to wear. So Jesus was not just a Jew. He looked like a Jew. He wore the clothes that you would expect a Jewish man to wear. He didn't say, don't wear these fringes, these tassels. It was just the guys that lengthened them that were looking for glory. And the reason why he could say that is because these tassels had to have very, very expensive blue thread in them. And there were various ways of copying the blue thread in a cheaper way. But if you lengthened your tassel, it showed that you had the money to do something that was more expensive than other people. So phylacteries, broadening the phylactery, that was just something that Jewish men were supposed to wear during prayer over the forehead and on the arm. And if you broadened that, that was somehow advertising your piety. But the contrast between advertising your piety and actually doing terrible things to the poor and being non-compassionate is something that Jesus was concerned about. Now, underneath the mantle, you think a big rectangular mantle, normally people would wear a tunic made in two parts, front and back, with stripes down the side. And often these tunics were very colorful. When you see Jesus films today, you can often see him in these very bland colors, and everyone's wearing bland colors. But in the first century, people loved color, especially bright red, which you could make with madder. And in fact, looking at this sofa display here, yesterday I was thinking, this is so like first century textiles, because we have first century textiles where there's stripes with these bright colors. It's not a colorless kind of society. Color meant a lot, but some colors were very, very expensive. So that's an ordinary mantle. You just wear that with a belt around the middle. And we've even got pictures now found in ancient capitalists of workmen wearing such tunics. So we know that this is the sort of thing that people wore, or men wore, these short tunics down to the knee. So those who wear long robes are not these kinds of workmen. Because as if you wear a short tunic, you're physically active, you're out there and doing things. Only if you wear long robes, you have leisure time. But we're told with Jesus' clothing, one really interesting thing, that in the story of the Transfiguration, he goes up on the mountain and his clothes were suddenly very, very white. So there's this visionary experience of Jesus having very, very white clothes that shows that he didn't have very white clothes beforehand. He would have worn something either maybe with a bit of color in it or something that really needed a good laundry powder to sort it out. So we've got this idea of before and after with Jesus just on this one occasion, and we can get the sense of him wearing something a bit rough. There's another thing that I find really fascinating, and it's in the Gospel of John, where the soldiers, they actually cast lots for what he's wearing as a tunic. And they cast lots for it because it's really not worth anything whole. They cast lots because they don't want to cut it up the way they've cut up his mantles. I think he wore 2 mantles that night because it was very cold. So they divide up his mantles into 4 parts. And archaeology has been really helpful here too, because in Kirbet Hazon on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, they have actually found these one-piece tunics. The trouble is, or maybe not such a trouble, the revealing thing is that these are under tunics. You wear a one-piece tunic under your proper tunic on top. And these are examples of children's tunics that were just, worn by poor children in the area. So Jesus, I think, was wearing something that wasn't even a proper tunic. He was, like Gandhi, wearing clothing that would be appropriate for the poor. And over his under tunic, he would have had this mantle, but it was very, very rough. Now, in terms of all the evidence I was sifting through, literary and archaeological and all the sorts of things that could be important for understanding the real look of Jesus, there's one particular piece by a Roman philosopher called Celsus, who is completely denouncing Christians. He doesn't like Christians, he doesn't think much of Jesus, and he writes against him. And what he says, essentially, is that Jesus is shabby. He looks like a beggar. There's nothing very nice about the way Jesus looks. And when the Christians defended themselves against Celsus, they defended all sorts of things that he said about them and about Jesus, but they never defended this. Because this is actually something that does tally with everything else we have on Jesus. It tallies with this little statement that, Jesus has a sense of his own homeless wandering. Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but this son of humanity has no place to lay his head. He was a wanderer. He was on the streets. He accepted charity from strangers. He was with the poor. And I think that's really important in terms of understanding his essential message. So just finally, in terms of the book, I have this image that I have now drawn of Jesus, and I invite you to color it in, or make your own picture of Jesus, thinking about the sorts of things that I think we can more reliably know about this man who lived 2,000 years ago. Thank you very much.